Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we'll be figuring out what to use next after M856A1 and other similar mid-game ammo in patch 0.13. As more players use class 5 armor, these middle pen rounds under 40 start to really struggle, but the higher tier bullets are now much more problematic to get a hold of with the flea bans and the removals from the traders. Here we'll be looking at conventional ammo, as leg meta is a whole different video, so starting with a baseline of cartridges with 44 pen as a minimum, which gets us into the 30% pen chance versus class 5 armor. Whether this is good enough or not comes down to, as usual, not just the damage and pen on the round itself, but what weapons that it can be used with, the fire modes available, the recoil, and the fire rate of the potential guns that will fire our bullets is also important to decide which is the best. Starting in progression order with the most easily accessible ammos first, we have SNB, which you can produce at Workbench level 2. Technically, this is available at level 20, as this is the bare minimum for getting to Mechanic 2, but obviously you have to have his rep sorted out as well. This is an interesting one because SNB is one of the best rounds in the entire game, but the only non-bolt action that it fits into is the SVD, which is why you don't see it more often. It's a bit of a clunky gun that you have to make some serious trade-offs with, either on recoil or ergo, and attempts to do both cost you a small fortune. However, if you can get the hang of it and use it with SNB, you don't have to worry about your opponents having armor ever again, which is a powerful proposition as it has a greater than 90% chance to pen even class 6 on the very first shot. The craft itself is really cheap, only costing about 350 rubles per round, and although you don't get much of it, only 80 per go, the usage with semi-auto weapons and the availability of other bullets like LPS that are decent and also accessible directly on the traders allows you to stack your mags effectively. For example, we could use 5 SNB on top and 5 LPS on the bottom if you're using 10 rounders. It has a short craft of only 10 hours base, which will be even shorter depending on your hideout levels, so it's perfect for running overnight. The other craft that we get access to at Workbench 2 is SP6 for the VSS and the AS Val. SP6 is very good for this stage of progression, almost identical to 7.62 BP, however the limitation is of course the weapons themselves. With the recoil changes, they're a little better than they used to be, but the AS Val is usually pretty expensive at around 140k, and the VSS is usually somewhere between 50 to 70 but can't really be modded. 20 round magazines are purchasable on Prapor 3 and the 30s at Prapor 4 or using the barter, which costs around 40k either which way you do it. That said, on semi they can be really powerful given the decent stats of the bullets. The SP6 craft is also very cheap in the hideout, costing around 460 rubles per bullet, and as you get 300, this is the most rounds per hour of the crafts that we're looking over today. Jumping up to the next milestone is a minimum of level 26 for Prapor 3. Here we get 2 outright purchases, SP6 again for the VSS and the Val, as well as 7.62x54R PS for the SVD. The SP6 purchase is a lot more pricey at 1,255 rubles, but something to bear in mind for later is that the time element of the Workbench starts to become much more relevant when we have Workbench 3, with many competing crafts for us to potentially do. The fact that we can just buy SP6 alongside doing something else in the hideouts that can only be made using it is certainly interesting, even if it costs a bit more. The same logic goes for the SVD's PS round. While we could already craft SNB, now that we can buy an 84 damage and 45 pen cartridge without touching the Workbench, this gives us the ability to use the SVD against higher tier armors whilst also making something else. At 805 rubles per round, it's not that bad either, considering the relatively low speed at which you deplete your ammo on semi-auto. The final one at Prapor 3 that we open up is the 545BS barter. This gives you 30 rounds, and technically you can get 4 of them per reset for 2 hot rods and 2 Marlboro cigarettes, but the barter is often sold out, so you have to get there near the beginning. 545BS is basically the only generic rifle round that you can purchase with over 40 pen at Prapor 3, hence the popularity, and costs around 1,400 each. Although this caliber in general gets a bad rap for low damage, with 51 pen you have a greater than 90% chance to pen class 5 on the first shot. The issue arises when in full auto spraying matches with other players who have higher flesh damage bullets and maybe wasting it on scavs. Although not deemed meta, it is possible to make BS work and stacks well in magazines alongside something like BT. Now the next jump up is at Prapor 4, which is level 36 minimum. Here we get an outright purchase of yet another SVD bullet, which is 54R BT, which is one of the highest pen rounds in the game available for cash. It's not quite as good as SNB on paper, but with 55 pen and high armor damage, it can still deal with class 6 in 3 hits normally and treats class 5 like butter. It's a nice step up from PS if you're not looking to craft SNB, but it is a tracer, so you have to bear that in mind. At Prapor 4, we also get another barter, this time for 9x39 BP, again for the VSS, but only after completing the quest Grenadier. This is the next step up from SP6 that we can actually obtain, and it does have incredible stats with 60 damage and 55 pen, which can also start to deal with class 6 armor. There's a limit of 10 for boxes of 8, so overall it's 80 per reset and costs around 1,400 each, but again we have to deal with the VSS or the Val to actually shoot it. The final contenders on the traders are at Peacekeeper 4 and one more level up to a minimum of 37. We get access to M855A1 and 556, which we can technically buy 90 of per reset, however this is sold out a bunch, so you have to get there near the beginning. This basically levels up all of your 556 favourites such as the SCAR or the AK-101 to make them competitive against Class 5, and we can continue to stack the 56A1 that we were using before underneath to preserve our ammo and not use it all in one raid. At this level of Peacekeeper, we also get access to M62, which is the step up from M80, and M80 is also on Peacekeeper 4. While it's extremely expensive at $14 per bullet, it is better against Class 5 than M80 is, and means that you don't have to craft M61 if you don't want to. So alongside the trader level milestones directly with the barters and cash purchases, at level 30 we can technically get Mechanic 3, which allows us to access the level 3 workbench. This is where our choices get tricky, as I mentioned, because we have to choose between the various options and we can't do them at the same time, which is why I've left it until the end. From the ammo that we spoke about already, SP6 and BP for the VSS can both be obtained outside of the workbench, so it's sort of a waste to make them in here even if it's cheap. That's really up to you though. All of the remaining ammo is craft only, and we have all of these here. When we're making any of them, we can't do anything else in the workbench, so we have to choose carefully. Starting broadly in damage order, APSX only works with the MP7, is the most expensive craft of all of them, and unfortunately because of its precise 35 damage combined with fall off over distance, it won't headshot anybody ever, even without a helmet. I personally think it should be tweaked to 36 damage to stop this at point blank at least, but with the longest base craft time of nearly a full day and the MP7's insanely high fire rate, it just doesn't really make sense to me to make this one. Igolnik is middling on cost and ammunition that it gives you per cycle, and it does have great penetration, but the damage issues from 545BS are amplified with this bullet. 37 can be okay in close quarters for a 3-shot thorax or 1 headshot, but issues over range prevent many players from wanting to use it, and personally there are better things to make in the workbench, especially as you can find a lot of the 545 ammo in raid instead. Now, M995 might be interesting. Given that you can only get a tiny amount of M855A1 per reset, and you need Peacekeeper 4 for it, and you need to be there early, this craft gives you 200 bullets, which is one of the highest, and stats wise with 42 damage and 53 pen, it's superior to 545BS. Bullets per hour is also the highest of all of the bottlenecked crafts that we're looking at here for a pretty reasonable price of around 1,000 rubles per round. This is certainly one to think about doing, especially if you've been using 556 a lot like myself and have gotten used to those guns and want to continue using them with slightly better ammunition. Next is 300 Blackout AP, which is a really tough one. This only works with the MCX and it does turn this weapon into a monster, especially after the various buffs that the gun has received. However, it's a little bit of a bullet hose with 800 RPM and only getting 120 per cycle is a bit rough. The next ammo down from AP is M62, which is very similar to M856A1, so 556 guns stack mags a little bit better as there isn't an equivalent to M855A1 in 300 Blackout. I do think the MCX is one of the best guns in theory for close and medium range combat with these bullets, but it's a really tough call to make them over the other options when they'll disappear so quickly. The old classic 762 BP is also on this menu and is a solid performer. I personally expect BP to make a resurgence when players routinely start getting to the Mutant and other similar low recoil guns, and the craft is distinctly middle of the road with 120 rounds per cycle, 15 hour base time and 1,500 rubles per round. However, as you can use it in the AKM series, which scale fairly well into the late game, BP benefits from a large variety of compatible decent weapons to use it with. It's usually worth crafting a stack of these to have around just in case you want to use it. Now, the ultimate cartridge, M61, is still available here too at Workbench 3. While it's one of the most expensive crafts, takes a really long time, and only gives you 80, as it's one of the single best bullets in the entire game, it well justifies the price. Depending on your gameplay style, these can stack well with M80 and M62 as well, and they're all good with high damage, as the primary fire mode in this caliber is semi-auto, which helps with ammo conservation in general. I think it's worth having some M61 around as well, just given the performance of the ammo and the power it has to delete enemy players from the map, because it's compatible with some of the best guns in the game at the same time. Now, we discussed SNB already, which at Workbench 2 is fine to make, but if you have Workbench 3, I personally think you should just buy PS or BT and use that instead in the SVD. The final bullet that we have to look at is the PS12B cartridge for the Ash 12. While the damage is super high, it's kind of on the threshold for penetration given the difficulty of using it in full auto, and with an expensive long craft that only gives 60 rounds and the high recoil of the Ash, I'm not sure if this one's worth doing. The next best rounds are also pretty bad, so it doesn't work very well with stacking ammunition in mags. While it can be fun, especially if you want to use it with the revolver, it wouldn't be my min-max choice. There is one special mention, which is the 338 Lapua Magnum FMJ cartridge, accessible on Peacekeeper 4. The only guns chambered in 338 currently are the AXMC Bolt Action and the Mark 18 Mjolnir, but the AXMC only requires you to complete the Sturman kill quest. Although it's a bolt action, I can make an exception here because of the fact that the bullet has a 50-50 chance of killing players instantly through brand new Class 5 armor, which puts it into a special category of its own. At $24 per round, it's obviously super expensive, but given that you should only be firing a couple, it's not really that big of a deal. So in summary, we should focus on those purchases and barters that don't go via Workbench 3 first, and then we can choose something from the rest to make overnight. Of these, I think M905, BP, and M61 are probably my top 3 choices, but you can have a play around depending on what you're feeling at the time. So next up, go and check out my video on the AK-101, which should pair very nicely with M905. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, hit all the buttons if you enjoyed the video, and as always, have fun in your raids.